Our first order of business is a presentation from Millone and MacBroom on enrollment projections.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
I'm just going to share my screen. Give me 1 second here. All right. Can everyone see that? Yeah, okay, great. All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Rebecca Auger, a principal planner with Millone and MacBroom. Mike, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, Mike Zuba. I'm the Director of Planning with Millone and MacBroom, and it's great to be able to present the findings from our enrollment study tonight.
All right, so we are going to move through a lot of information. So I think it would be best if we tried to hold off on questions until the end, but please jot them down along the way because we are going to be presenting a lot of data. So we're going to start off with just a comprehensive review and analysis of demographics and housing trends within the community, and then move into enrollment trends. And Mike will go through our enrollment projections and talk about next steps in our planning process. So we start with a look at just total population change and what the trends have been over the last decade. And there's been an estimated 2% decrease overall for the township. However, as this map is showing you, the change has not been evenly spread throughout the community, where you have pink areas around Harmony and New Monmouth schools. There was actually an estimated decline in population, similarly down in the southern end of the community at around the Lincroft area, whereas other areas were estimated to have increased over the last decade. When we take a look at the age composition or profile of the community, it's clear that you are a family-oriented community. When we take a look at a chart such as this on the left-hand side of the screen, it's called an age-sex pyramid, where we're looking at males on the left and females on the right. And we see these two sort of bubbles or bulges on these areas. That's a typical family-oriented suburban community profile, where you have working age, family age adults and student population. But what we see here is actually a decline in both of those population segments. And that is what this chart is portraying on the right, which is an increase or a decrease in these age brackets. And you can see that it's actually in the student age population or younger, and that sort of mid-career family age working adult population. So there is an estimated decline in that. However, you still have a general profile of a family-oriented community. We do see an aging profile, which is typical given the aging of the baby boom generation. And you did experience some increase in young working age population, which may be a sign of things to come. When we take a look at trends in births for Middletown Township, you can see that you had a much higher birth rate in the late 90s, early 2000s. You had a period of really steady decline and really starting before and during and around the time of the recession. However, you saw a pretty significant increase in 2016 and 18. You've actually increased about 15% from 2015 to 2018. And those are all birth cohorts that have yet to enter the system, or at least the 2015 year should have entered the system this year. So that's just something to be aware of in your enrollment projections. You do have rising birth rates starting to feed the next few years. The 2019 data that we were able to obtain from the state is very preliminary. They haven't included out-of-state birth occurrences for 2019 yet. So we know it's preliminary data. However, we know that it is likely to be slightly down from 2018. We take a look at unemployment rates to get an understanding of the overall economic health of the community, and to look at these trends in unemployment relative to birth and population changes to see if there's any correlation there. And you had an historic low unemployment in 2019 of about 3%. You were generally right in line with New Jersey as a state's unemployment rate, although slightly lower. We know that the last 6 months have changed all of this. We had looked in May, and as of at that time, unemployment was more around 14% for Middletown Township. And there's just a lot of volatility around this right now. So when we started to try to tie the birth trends to unemployment trends, we did develop a regression model that was fairly statistically reliable, but it was reliant on a county unemployment rate, which again is just so volatile right now that we didn't feel comfortable using that regression model to try to project births moving forward, which we need to feed our enrollment projection model. Therefore, we fell back onto mathematical models. We used a moving average to develop a low, medium, and high to give us a range around the birth projections that we're feeding into our overall enrollment projection model. And you can see those low, medium, and high projections shown here in this chart. The high keeps you at that sort of high 2018 year, whereas the low drops you back down to sort of the average of the last few years. Taking a look at the composition of households within the community, again, family-oriented community with about 30% of your households, including children. Of married couple family households with children, about 70% have only school-aged children. So your families are really oriented around families that have students in the system. There's not as many that have up and coming students or younger children under the age of 6. So overall in demographic trends, we see a relatively stable population, although you did experience loss in that working age, family age, and student age population groups. We saw a significant increase in birth rate over the last few years, which should impact your enrollment projections moving forward. And while you are a family-oriented community, the households that have children tend to have older school-age, school-ready children, not up-and-coming younger students or soon-to-be students. When we move into housing, housing is estimated to have decreased, but again, it's not as evenly felt around the community as the overall number would indicate. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to move my screen so I can read the data on here. So again, what we're showing you is a map of the community where there is green. There's actually an estimate of an increase in total housing units. All of the brownish shades are an estimate of decrease in housing units. So there were only a couple of areas in the community that were estimated to have actually seen an increase in housing units between 2010 and 2018. This map is actually showing us occupied housing units that are renter occupied as opposed to owner occupied. And we can see there are pockets within the community where there was increases in rental housing spread around the New Monmouth area, the Village area, Lincroft again, Leonardo, Fairview. And then the rest of the community experienced some small decreases in renter occupancy. However, overall, the community did see an increase in renter occupancy in housing units, and it's now estimated to be around 17% of all housing units. And when we look at who is residing in those renter occupied units versus owner occupied units, we see there's actually more senior residents in those renter occupied units. It's just a greater proportion at 37% with householders age 65 or above in rental units versus 27% of seniors in owner occupied units. So when we take a look at construction and we see this chart showing us single family permits in orange and multifamily permits in gray, and we see some spikes in multifamily permitting here and there, we we know that there's a greater proportion of seniors moving into that style of multifamily housing. At least that has been the trend most recently. So housing permits were clearly very impacted by the recession of 2008. You can see the levels prior to that in the 200s per year, dropped right off, and have only recently started to rebound, really beginning in 2015 and on. You have recovered to some pre-recessionary levels, and the construction has been in single family and multifamily, so a mixture of housing. Taking a look at home sales, this data was provided by the assessor, and it's really kind of a remarkable trend where you've seen steadily increasing sales since about 2014 and really up to at least recent historic highs for the community. It's really been a very sharp growth trend, and you've reached to over 1,400 sales per year. When we take a look at those sales and where they're located within the community, we can see some trends where they're not balanced across all elementary attendance zones. And I'll just make a note here that when we talk about the New Monmouth elementary zone, we are talking about a combination of New Monmouth and the old Port Monmouth, so that it's already combined in our data analysis. And what we did here is just plot out where the home sales that were recorded by the assessor are located in which elementary attendance zone. And you can see that Nut Swamp, River Plaza, and Bayview have a higher share of sales over the last 4 years. Middletown Village and Leonardo areas have a lower share relative to the whole. Working with the planning department of the township, we identified several housing developments that are up and coming and anticipated. They are either recently built, under construction, or have been approved or are in consideration and pending approval. So we identified almost 600 of such housing units. And they are located at these various stars on the map. And what we're showing you on this map in the colored areas are your elementary attendance zones. So you can see that the housing developments are scattered throughout the community by and large, but there are two that I'll call your attention to here with the Heritage development and here with Middletown Walk. Those represent almost 90% of those anticipated 600 units. So those are what we paid most attention to in our analysis. And because there's such a significant number of units associated with those two developments, we decided to estimate the number of students that would be generated by those two. So again, Heritage at Middletown, or the American Properties, is currently under construction. It's in the Middletown Village attendance zone as it is zoned currently. It would be 176 units with 20% of those affordable. The affordable units are primarily 1 and 2 bedrooms. However, there are 8 units that will have 3 bedrooms. And then we conservatively assumed, because we couldn't get exact numbers, that all of the market rate units would be 3 or more bedroom. For Middletown Walk, which is an approved project but not under construction as far as I know, it located in the Fairview attendance zone area. That would be 350 total units with 20% affordable again. The affordable units again are primarily 1 and 2 bedrooms. However, there would be 18 units that have 3 bedrooms. And then we again assumed that all of the market rate units would be 3 bedrooms. What we did with that set of numbers is apply student generation multipliers from Community Data Analytics, which is an eConsult Solutions Inc. product. It's based on the 5-year Census American Community Survey, their public use microdata sample. We're using numbers that are for the Philadelphia and Princeton, New Jersey region from 2018. And what those multipliers do is estimate the number of public school age children. They may not necessarily be enrolled in Middletown Township, that they would be attending a public school of some sort that would be generated by these housing units. And it's broken down by whether the housing units are market rate or affordable, whether they are own or renter style, and the number of bedrooms within each units. So that is why we needed to collect this sort of data on those two developments. When we applied those student generation multipliers, we came up with Heritage estimated to generate 115 public school age children at full build out. And that Middletown Walk would generate approximately 232 school age children at full build out. And as Mike will talk about later, these multipliers were added into our projections over a number of years. I believe we assumed Heritage would begin occupancy 2 years from now and would roll up to full build out over the period of 3 years. And Middletown Walk would begin occupancy 5 years from now and also roll up to full build out in about a 3-year span. So overall for housing, obviously sales and construction were hit hard by the recession, as well as impacts from Superstorm Sandy. Rental units have increased slightly while ownership units have decreased, indicating some likely conversion of ownership units to rental because we didn't see a significant buildup of new multifamily construction. However, really there's been strong recovery apparent in both construction and sales over the last 4 years. And as we talked about with Heritage and Middletown Walk, you have two major developments that will likely have an impact on enrollment moving forward. So now switching gears to enrollment trends. And here we're showing you just trends from 2014-15 on to 2019-20. And you can see for K through 12 district-wide, a steadily decreasing trend of about 2%. The elementary enrollment has decreased 7% over the last 6 years. You can see a lot of the drop-off has been at the elementary level, somewhat at the middle school level. There's actually been some increase at the high school level shown in green. Just plotting out where your students reside and the elementary attendance zones. So on this map, the colored area again is showing you the attendance zone for the school, and the colored dots are students represented. The colors represent which school they actually attend. And so you can see where you have more dense school districts up in Ocean Ave, Harmony, and the like, and then you have some more of your spread out Lincroft area, even Nut Swamp and Navesink to some degree. When we look at the trends by the individual schools, again, that loss was not evenly experienced throughout the community. So you can see some of the schools that experienced the largest decrease include Navesink, New Monmouth, and again, when we talk New Monmouth, we're talking New Monmouth and the old Port Monmouth areas combined, as well as River Plaza. However, on the other side of the spectrum, you had Leonardo increase almost 22% over the same time span. Obviously, a much smaller school than some of these others that we're talking about, nonetheless, a pretty significant increase. Taking a look at the middle schools, again, showing you your attendance areas, Bayshore, Thorne in the gold, and Thompson in the pink, and where the students reside for those schools. And the trends here, while you had an overall decrease of about 1% from 2014-15 to 2019-20, even though within there you actually had some increases, the Thorne School experienced the greatest decrease at about 6%, whereas Thompson increased slightly by 4%. And then taking a look at the high schools, Middletown High School South shown in the red, so split with Middletown High School North. And again, you've experienced an increase in the high school enrollments of 4%. However, it's primarily been at South High School, which has more than made up for a slight decrease at North High School of about 4%. So just to get an understanding of some of the enrollment trends at the individual school level, we identified students that we classified as new to the district, and we do that simply by looking at student ID numbers from one year to the next. So we obviously don't include kindergarten because even if they were in pre-K, most kindergartners are new to the district. And we're just looking for in-migration sort of analysis of understanding, are there more students coming into a particular area of the community? And as you can see, we've identified about 375 per year students that are new to the district. And when we look at the individual elementary schools, Lincroft stands out as having experienced a greater number, as well as Middletown Village and Nut Swamp. Typically, there is more in migration at the younger grade levels when students are more likely to make a move to get their student age kids into a certain district. But nonetheless, you do see some new to district students at all levels here with the middle schools and the high schools as well. So in-migration can result from many different things. It could be an actual movement into the district. It could be a transfer either from a private school or some other public system, or just a changing in some type of housing issue. What we did with that data, those new to district students, is try to identify if any of them are related to a housing sale, to see if housing sales are really bringing a lot of new students into the district. And only about 10% of the students that we identified as new could be attributed to a housing sale in the previous year. So again, other sources of immigration appear to be more at play here than housing sales. And when we saw that increase in rental units, even though we know a greater proportion of elderly folks are living in rental housing, that may have something to do with immigration that we're seeing. On average, we were calculating that each housing sale generates about 0.1 students in grades 1 through 12 across the district. Mike, you want to take it from here?
Thanks, Rebecca. As you can see, we've spent the first half of the slide deck really going through not only the enrollment, the housing, the demographics at the neighborhood level, but also the district level as well, to get a good understanding of what's been happening in your community and how best to be able to take that information and use it to prepare accurate projections going forward. The methodology we really rely on to do that, and it's really one of the gold standards for it, especially when you're trying to produce grade level specific data at individual schools, is the cohort survival methodology. And that's really based on the principle of that the observed data from the recent past is going to be a good predictor of what's likely going to happen in the future. And that relies on either stable growth, stable decline, flat enrollment. As we get hit with things like a great recession, a major storm, a pandemic, that throws a lot of that into fluctuation, and that it becomes a little bit more difficult to model. But we like to be able to prepare 3 different scenarios for each of our projections, a high, medium, and low. In this case, and we'll talk about a little bit later on, is that we found the medium to be the best fit based on all of the underlying data we've been looking at. And it really relies on different assumptions, especially for those last 5 years of our enrollment projections, in order to be able to gauge what we don't have good proxy data for, what would be a likely event in the future, especially for some of those younger grades, because we don't have birth records for that. And then last but not least, as Rebecca talked about, we have several developments that we don't feel are captured in the cohort survival, sort of baked into those historic persistencies. So that's where we pivot from the methodology and look at more of a modified cohort survival, where we're adding in those external factors from housing developments that we know are either approved or under construction and maybe not yet occupied, and make some assumptions there on how they're going to phase in and scale up over time. Can you hit me with the next one? So as we'll talk about the historic enrollment a little bit, I know Rebecca went through it at each grade level. We look at the survivability from one year to the next, and that's what forms the basis for the persistency ratios. So when we'll start showing numbers of a persistency ratio of 1, that may mean that a cohort of 100 grew to 100, or a persistency of 1.05 means a cohort of first grade students grew from 100 to 105. And what we find as we start, really digging into those different persistency ratios and comparing it to what we're seeing in not only the housing market from a sales standpoint or from a permitting and construction standpoint, is that we can then correlate what's happening on the ground to what's happening within the students in the buildings, and best be able to project what's likely going to happen going forward. With any projections, they're always based on some caveats and assumptions, especially at the individual grade level. As we project out 10 years, we're making assumptions that under these projections, as we're showing them, that there won't be changes to the attendance zones that will significantly shift students from one school to the next. We know programmatic deployments such as pre-K have impacts on numbers, as well as the prevalency of how many students in your community may opt to attend private school. So what we're doing is we're looking at the most recent trends and using those as a good barometer of what's going to happen going forward. Some other ones that we look at are just the general overall housing and employment assumptions. I know, as Rebecca discussed earlier, we talked a lot about the volatility recently in the unemployment market, as well as within the housing market. And that's where, as demographers, we rely more heavily under those stable times, as we talked about the 2019 data that we're reflecting back on. And last but not least, it's those demographic multipliers, the student generation, those assumptions holding true in order to be able to have the most accurate assumptions or projections going forward. So here's just a snapshot of your enrollment history and things that jumped out at us. We're just looking at a small grade cohort in third grade, as well as having some larger cohorts in the high school. So where we start to see, as we call them, bubbles move through, a bubble moving out of an elementary school oftentimes causes a little bit of dip in elementary and then causes a little bit of a spike in the middle schools. The same can be said as if you have a high school with 2 bubbles in it. As they matriculate on through out of the school system, you'll note a pronounced dip there. And a lot of the trends that we see, at least in the next 5 years, that are happening and being projected for those middle school and high school are largely a result of students that are already in seats and that are just matriculating through your system, bubbles that have occurred a couple of years ago that have just been moving through, or even some small grade cohorts that have never really added students, but for various reasons are just matriculating on through. So as we talk a little bit more about the cohort survival, this is a snapshot of really your last 5 years, looking at those persistency ratios. And one of the most difficult grades to project is obviously kindergarten. That's where we look for some stability in that birth to K number, using births 5 years prior as the benchmark for what your likely kindergarten would look like, that given year multiplied by that persistency ratio. So we track that growth or decline across the board. Largely what we've been seeing over the last 5 years has been immigration within your school system. And what we do is we track the sum of your 1st through 7th grades and compare that with the 2nd through 8th grade the following year, and look at the growth within that grade group or group of grades. And that's shown on the right-hand column. For the 1920 school year, you had one of your higher estimates of migration in the last several years. However, in 1819, despite having a large birth to K, you also had one of your lowest estimates of migration that year. So this is a good way to help visualize that birth to K relationship, with the red line on top being your kindergarten and the births, the blue line on the bottom, being the births lagged 5 years. So you could see in 2016, 17, as well as 17, 18, we had nearly a 1-to-1 or a persistency ratio of 1 there for that birth decay, where we were almost returning a similar number of kindergartners as you had births 5 years prior. In 2018 and 19, we had this big disconnect where your birth decay jumped up to 1.8, which was a little bit of an anomaly when it was stable for 2 years prior to that. And then in 1920, we saw that gap narrow a little bit, but still an immigration of students that weren't born within your community. And what that tells us is whether it's through housing sales or movement within the rental market or some other factor, we're seeing families moving in with children in tow that may not have been born in your community 5 years prior to that. So for our enrollment projections, I mentioned we prepared a high, medium, and low model. You can see the 3 spaghetti strands here on the chart with the blue line representing that high model. That's assuming an increase in the overall housing activity as well as higher persistency ratios, so elevated levels of immigration into the township school system. The medium model, shown in the orange color in the middle, assumes that we're going to have sort of a status quo or steady housing conditions as you've experienced, as well as enrollment trends that you have experienced. And this is the model that we're identifying as our recommended model. And then we have our low model, which assumes a decline in the overall housing activity, as well as lower immigration and lower persistency ratios going forward. So in looking at the district-wide projections for the medium model, we're showing an overall stability in the system. When we begin sort of looking at the K-12 enrollment as a whole, we're projected to decline by about 2% over 5 years, but have a rebound in those next 5 years to have a slight gain of less than 1% over that 10-year horizon. So even though we're looking at having some undulations in between and a decline and sort of your bottoming out, shall I say, in years 22, 23, or 23, 24, we're now showing a little bit of a rebound there. The K-5 enrollment is projected to increase by about 3% in the first 5 years of the projection horizon, and then 6% overall, topping out at about 4,300 students, or exactly 4,286 at the end of that 10-year horizon. Both middle schools and high schools are expected to shrink throughout the first 5 years of the projection horizon. As we talked about, getting some of those larger birth cohorts coming into the system is really leading to some of the elementary and then some of those grade cohorts flattening out, where we have similar cohorts that are exiting, that are entering. We see a little bit of growth there and some flattening out at around 2,250 students or so, and then with a bump back up in that last year of the 2,930 to 2,370 students for the 6-8 system. The high school is projected to decline and then really flatten out, really starting about 24, 25 at about 2,800 students or so, give or take, as those grade cohorts, those 2 bubbles that I mentioned, move out of the system and then are replaced by similar size cohorts as they matriculate up through the middle school into the back half of this projection horizon. Taking a deeper look into the elementary schools and really looking at the individual level, even though from the 1920 number of just over 4,000, we're showing growth up to 4,286 students. We're not showing growth, that level of growth across the board. As Rebecca mentioned, especially with the addition of the multipliers for the 2 schools within Middletown Village attendance zone, as well as Fairview, those are projected to be some of our largest growers over the next decade. Fairview is expected to grow 44 students in the next 5, and then 116 overall, as well as Middletown Village is expected to grow 70 and then flatten out a little bit overall as we back off those student generation multipliers. but we're also seeing some stability across the board, as well as a couple of the school attendance zones and the individual elementary schools are projected to experience some modest decline, where Navasink is projected to experience the greatest decline overall of about 20 students, or about an 8% decline for that horizon. For the middle school projections, we're projecting that both Bayshore and Thompson, at least for the first 5 years, will remain relatively stable. Thorne, on the other hand, will experience a decline for the first 5 years out to 24, 25. Bayshore then, starting in 25, 26, really starts to experience a bit of a rebound, eventually topping out at just over 700 students, or about a 15% gain over the 10-year horizon, whereas Thompson experiences a rebound, but to a lesser degree, tops out at just over 1,000 in 29-30 school year. And then Thorne overall has a little bit of a slower rebound, and that really doesn't occur until the very end of our 10-year projection horizon. So Thorne overall is looking at about 600 students for the last half of the 5 years, and then really in that last year, seeing a little bit of an uptick there. For the middle school projection, both of the middle schools respectively are going to experience about a 5 or 6% decline. North High School at 5%, South High School at 7% for the first 5 years. And then that decline continues, matching up with the district-wide projections. However, North High School stays on that same track of erosion of students, eventually ending up with about 1,340 or so students at the back half of the projection horizon, whereas South High School has a little bit of a steeper decline, dropping down to 1,436 students for the last 2 years of the projection horizon. So now that we've wrapped up really the enrollment portion of our study, we're looking forward to the next steps, which include finalizing the capacity numbers, especially as we begin to talk about utilization of the individual schools. We know, especially working with many different clients right now with students going back in, it's a difficult time, and this is a task that requires us to be able to engage the building leadership. So we're eager to be able to have some conversations with the building leadership as time permits, and just address some of the questions that we have and begin to finalize those capacity numbers in order to then produce our utilization analysis, which will really be year by year, but really be focusing on what those space implications are over a 5 and 10 year, and then looking at it not only at the individual school, but at those various grade groupings to be able to understand where some pressures may be for space and where some excess capacity may exist within the individual schools. And then overall present the findings of that to the strategic planning committee and continue to work to develop some framework to be able to look at and vet some options based on the findings of our study to date. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to the board for any questions that you may have for Rebecca or myself.
I have a couple of questions. What is your margin of error in this plan?
So margin of error around the projections?
Yeah.
For our enrollment projections, we've historically benchmarked at 1% per year, regardless of our community size that we're working in. We do recognize that, I've gone back doing projections for 20 years that we'll have a larger percent of error when we have unforeseen events. But overall, we're within 1% consistently for school districts per year. The cohort survival isn't a methodology where we have a control group where we have a true expected result to have a margin for error. So it's not done in a vacuum. So what we do is we consistently go back and, for the 30 communities we work for every year and the ones we've historically worked for, we constantly benchmark our data against that to use our methodology to see how that has performed and be able to apply that number to our projections. For for our methodology, where we do produce a high, medium, and low, we are hedging bets on some of those long-term uncertainties within various communities. If, you know, the question revolves around things that we can't foresee in the future. And in this case, we've looked at the medium projections, and we feel like that's going to be a very good proxy, at least for the space planning going forward that we're being asked to do.
Do we look like we're on target for our October enrollment of the 1,962 students?
We haven't gotten a preliminary enrollment update yet, and we would like to look at that, certainly moving forward.
Yeah, and one of the things too that we'd like to look at moving forward is, in some of our other communities, we've noticed with the various models that a community opted for, at least to start the school, the numbers changed from, say, the September early, or the late August, early September numbers to the October numbers, based on parents' choice with what those models were. That's something we're gonna want to look at as well, to see how the preliminary enrollment numbers may have changed as you've moved into, you know, the start of the school year and then into your October numbers.
And the other question I have, I mean, the pandemic is definitely an unusual situation. And when you drive around town, you see houses being sold in one day.
Yeah.
Bidding wars going on. How are you going to keep up with the enrollment of seeing who's moving into these houses? Because obviously there are big houses being sold, families moving in. How do you account for those students?
Yeah. And I think that's what Mike was driving at in his discussion of the margin of error. We just can't, you know, in a really concrete and finite way, account for that at this time. It's something that the district certainly needs to be monitoring, and you know, you may need to adjust enrollment projections as you move into a design phase of your strategic planning thinking. But we do feel that that medium model is a good baseline for starting the planning process around space considerations, knowing that that high range is there as well for benchmarking purposes.
Yeah, Rebecca, great point. And we're seeing it doing a bulk of our work in the New York metro area, including Lower Fairfield County, a lot of the communities, a lot of the well-regarded suburban communities and school systems that are seeing the influx of new families, the increase in housing sales. I think as we move into that next reconfiguration and that planning phase, it would behoove us to be able to benchmark potentially against both of those numbers. And that's one of the reasons why we do have our methodology the way we have it, is that it allows us to easily pivot over and do that, and to be able to have that number there.
I hope we really do keep a good check on this, because anything that you guys are recommending for us to do and we don't have those right numbers, we're going to pay for it as a community down the line.
I'm a little concerned. I'm concerned about what you were saying about the people moving in, because the community has a lot of people moving in. With COVID, it brought a lot. I think Middletown is like number 6 in the state of New Jersey with the increase in population. When you look at it from people moving in and buying, it's because of where we are and how we commute, as far as people are working from home. But if they do have to get into a place, they can commute easily. I'm a little bit concerned when you say you have a 1% margin of error there. I think it might be larger, especially with this year being 2020 and going forward for 2021, because we don't know what to expect. And
that's a good discussion point. And Rebecca, can you just flip us back to that? I believe it was slide with the high, medium, and low projections on it. So without having any of the 2020 data in front of us for where you're at, we prepared this based off of 1920 and elevated housing activity, elevated immigration, and began looking at what that could mean. So I think with this model and then getting some real data, I think we're going to be in a good position for the space planning. I think one of the long-term questions that keeps coming up in some of the other communities we're working in is how long will this last? So we're seeing some tighter markets, supply-driven markets. We know construction does take a while. What's already been in your planned, approved, and pipeline is likely going to be what's going to carry you forward. And I think as Rebecca talked through the details of the multipliers of what the new stock is coming online, that was wise to be able to capture that into these numbers. But also then begin to sort of look at, in 10 years from now, is this move to the suburbs still going to be put in place? And that's something that I don't think anybody has an answer to right now, but it's something that we want to be cognizant of. So, we have a lot of tools at our disposal to try the best we can to future-proof as we get into this planning phase. And we're open to being able to review those additional data points and seeing if any adjustments need to be made.
Hey, Mike, it's Nick DeFranco. I want to just sort of clarify something I'm looking at here on this slide, and thank you for going back to this slide, because I know you said that you have the high, medium, and low model, but to my eyes, it looks like the medium model does tend to the high side. So rather than being a down the middle sort of medium model, it looks to me like you're accounting for the variability in the influx of new residents plus the 600 some odd units coming online by trending towards that higher number. So I think sort of addressing Leonora's concern, I would agree that, staking your 1% might be a risky gamble, but also, it looks like you've hedged towards the side of caution on that by, the middle model and the high number are barely separated until you get out to 2024, 2025. So it looks like you're being appropriately conservative here.
Yeah, Nick, great point. I mean, I've been through the housing boom of the early 2000s doing enrollment projections, and I see a lot of similarities of the suburban movement back then to what the suburban movement is now. And you're right, Rebecca and I did put our foot on the pedal early on in these to be able to bring that medium model up to best account for everything that we've, as planners, that we've been seeing, hearing. Even though the data points may not be in yet, we have a feel for what's happening in our metro area.
Thank you.
So can we get explained to us what's the next step?
Yep.
And you might have already said it, but I'd like to be clear about it.
Yeah, so Rebecca and I have put together some preliminary capacity school by school in order to be able to understand those a little better. We've just been waiting for the right time to be able to engage the building leadership to be able to address some of our questions that we have, as well as clarify a couple areas. And then what we'll do is we'll assign capacities to each of the school buildings and then apply the enrollment projections to those to be able to look at what your space needs are going to be over the next 5 to 10 years. And this is where, as we move that process along, it may be beneficial, depending on what we see with the preliminary enrollment for this year, is to be able to look at those with the blue line and the orange line, or that high and medium model as well. We've done that a lot in the past, especially in situations, not a pandemic, but in rapid growth situations, in order to really understand what those space needs are. And then what we're going to be able to do is, based on the findings from that, really begin to have a more robust and rich conversation on what could some potential options look like. And then Rebecca and I will go back and we'll go through running some scenarios, and then be able to come back and present what the implications are and considerations for the various options that we're looking at are.
Okay, and can we get a copy of this presentation on our website?
Yes,
Yep.
we'll post it to the website tomorrow morning.
I have a question. It's Robin Stella. Can we just circle back to for a second to the New Monmouth, Port Monmouth consolidation? So with those two schools merging, did you say we're still down over 100 students? You went past that slide quickly.
Yes. So that's over the last 5 years, again, looking at 2019-20
Okay.
as the ending point for that.
And then on slide 38, we had taken that ending point and projected it forward. I think it was 38, if I recall.
So now you're looking future.
Right.
Yes, yes.
Okay, here we are.
And then what we're seeing is stability overall for the first 5 years, really stability overall for the next 10 years, with your enrollment ranging from 480 to just over 500, 510 students, with some undulations in between. So, I would look at that and say that that's, about 500 students overall.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry, what's the max at New Monmouth?
The max.
Do we have that slide? I think that's on our website. I'm just.
In terms of capacity, you mean?
Right, the max at capacity.
I don't.
Yeah, I'd rely on the district at this point for that answer.
Right, I just want to make sure we're not
I don't have that information
getting anywhere near there.
this
I
time.
feel like it's like 550 or something, but I don't remember. Okay, thank you.
Being you're asking for the max of New Monmouth, I'd like to see the max for Thompson, Even Village, Lincroft, all the schools that are heavily attended.
Well, I think based on what we heard, I think that's part of the next step is to go down to that building level. So, I think the strategic planning committee, and John, I don't know if you're on, I think that will be our next, instead of our next, committee meetings, to work with Millone and MacBroom to get those numbers together. And also, as they said, they'd like to be in touch with our building level personnel to make sure that we're not just doing a numerical analysis, but there's a really a strong feel for the community impacts of the numbers that we're looking at.